And where do you see the big risk? So clearly you think the recession risk is overpriced in the market right now. Is there anything else that is kind of sitting in the back of your mind as, okay, this might be the worrisome thing?
I think the biggest risk is that inflation doesn't move back down durably to central banks' 2% targets. And put out something a little earlier this week. If you just scan through the data and you look at those data points related to, say, UK inflation, stabilizing, core inflation stabilizing at a level that's around 5%. The Bank of England's mandate is 2. It is not 5. And so, 5 is very far from 2. And if it stabilizes at 5, that's going to be a real problem. And there's some real risks related to that, given that wage growth is growing at between 6 and 7%, depending on how you measure it. And the UK has real productivity stagnation. The same thing in Europe, although Europe's a little bit better, but we did see a pop in inflation in the most recent print. Canada, you're seeing, inflation looks like it's stabilizing in that sort of 3 to 4 range. Australia, the timeliest inflation numbers popped and, looks like it's stabilizing in the 5% range. Like that whole US CPI looks like it's stabilizing between 3 and 4%. Like you sort of add all those up and you sort of look at it and you go, what's the world going to be like if in 6 months we've sort of stabilized here in inflation? And then additionally, what does that world look like if a number of these disinflationary pressures that have been important in bringing and resolving inflation from being very high to where it is today, what if those disinflationary pressures flip inflationary? In the US, we've benefited, like gas prices have gone from $5 to $4 to $3 a gallon. That's a big disinflationary impulse in the economy. What happens if gas prices start to rise again? Goods prices globally have gone from rising in price to meaningfully contracting in price. What happens if that starts to moderate, go to zero, or go to positive as a result of some of these geopolitical tensions that are going on? All of that is a very worrisome circumstance, particularly in the context of a set of global bond markets that are really pricing in expectations of a rapid shift to cuts over the course of 24.
Yeah, and in that scenario where inflation stabilizes but stays well above central bank mandates, well above the 2% where it's an explicit mandate, well above 2 where it's more implicit, what do you think central banks do? Do they just say, well, we got to keep tightening up financial conditions, we got to raise rates?
Well, I think the central banks are actually in a pretty good position here in a way to respond to if that circumstance arises, which is the central banks can get a meaningful tightening of conditions simply by doing nothing. So that's a pretty good position to be in, right? Because they can basically say, instead of, cutting in line with what's priced into the markets, they can just not ease consistent with that. They can they can just hold current policy. Let's say instead of higher for longer, it's high for longer, right? That policy is going to be a lot more defensible. It's reasonably defensible. Look, we're just taking in more data. We're seeing what's going on, et cetera, and would probably allow them to maintain economic conditions to continue to see that growth while implementing slightly tighter monetary policy, which hopefully could moderate things enough to start to ease some of the pressures off on inflation. But the real sticky point is what happens if 2 steps down the line, which is these economies are fine, inflation settles in at a rate that's a little too high. Central banks basically, stand back from the easing cycle that's expected. You get a tightening of financial conditions, and it's just not enough tightening of financial conditions to then create, inflation moving even further down. That's a sticky point. But, between then and where we are today, there's a relatively straightforward policy of doing nothing that could, go a long way.